But yep, I'm good. Sorry.
All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Doge and Aydin Show. We are live. Pretty sure we're live. And yep, we are. And I am your host, Brian, and I'm here with Aydin, so who's always, obviously, her name is in the,
Hello.
in the thing. And but we have a very special guest. Today we have Helen Pluckrose. In case you don't know who she is, which, shame on you for not knowing. Helen is from the UK, so this is one of the reasons why we had a little bit of some time issues. But she is one of the people that was involved with. I don't want to misrepresent this, but you're one of three people who wrote a series of, I guess you could say, hoax papers, academic papers, right? And well, tell me a little bit about what you had in mind and what your plan was.
Yeah, well, we've always been very resistant to the H word because our papers were proper papers. We weren't trying to sneak through things that that journals wouldn't want to publish if they were paying attention. We drew on a body of existing scholarship that was there, used real ideas to produce our own arguments and get them published, and the point of that was really to gather a lot of stuff together to show what was out there in various kinds of identity studies that take a sort of postmodern critical theory approach. We wanted to bring all of that together and show some of the worst ideas and then use them to make some truly terrible ideas of our own and show that these can get not only passed through but encouraged and even sort of made worse by the way the reviewers direct us. So I think sometimes if people are thinking hoax, it sounds a bit like a trolling attempt, like a trick. But as the journalists have pointed out themselves, and a lot of them are standing by our papers, they're saying that what we wrote was good. Then they are real papers. It's kind of an exploration of what's there.
Yeah, I would actually really quickly expand upon that. One thing that I noted while reading through your work of you and your colleagues is actually that you oversight more than what I would typically see in those fields or in any field of an extreme dedication to detail and citation of other literature. So to call it, a hoax paper is a little bit of a misnomer in that, again, one of the, it was the dog park study was listed as a exemplary piece of research by the journal it was published in, because I would say that based on the other literature that is submitted to similar journals, it would have been considered exemplary based on the literature review alone.
Thank you. I'm glad that you've picked up on that because people are tending to miss this, thinking we've just used some jargon and written some random rubbish and managed to sneak it through. But no, it is, as you said, they're proper papers. They're drawing on the ideas that worry us and using them. So yeah, what the journals should do, really, apart from the ones where we've actually made up data, and we've been criticised for that, and I get that. But the point was that not only was the data so shoddy in the first place, we drew conclusions from it that just weren't warranted. That was why we had to have it in there. I think the journals should actually stand by the papers because they accepted them on their worth. They're still saying they have worth. I'm not sure why the fact that we didn't mean them and we knew that we were writing deeply nonsensical and unethical rubbish should stop them from still standing by the work.
There are several studies actually that you included in that, such as the feminist, I think it was the one that was submitted to the Journal of Therapy and Poetry. There's no data required for that. So I don't see why they wouldn't stand by such a paper when it is just speculation, essentially, or theory and opinion in the first place. There's other ones, such as the fat bodybuilding paper as well, that didn't really require data in terms of statistical analysis. So I would agree. I don't know why they wouldn't stand by those, particularly when they, several of them, having read the reviewers' reports, said it was excellent scholarship. So yeah, absolutely.
Particularly at our Hypatia one, The Joke's on You, which just brings together a lot of feminist and critical race epistemology to essentially argue that there is no legitimate way to criticise social justice scholarship. That one doesn't draw on any, that rely on any data at all. It is just an argument, and we're hoping Hypatia will stand by it and will put our names on it. I'm very sure they won't, but that if they really believe what they're saying, it shouldn't matter who said it and why. What should matter is the content.
Mm-hmm. I think part of that problem is, and I'm sorry I keep interrupting.
No, it's okay, Aydin. Go to town.
Hypatia is arguably the leading journal in feminist scholarship, and for this to be published in Hypatia is a really big deal. When we talk about the value of a journal in publications in different forms of academia, Hypatia is pretty much the top of the stack when it comes to feminist scholarship. So that's a big one. The other one, the I forget which one it was published in, the Mein Kampf sort of one. That one also didn't require any data. That one was just opinion as well. So those two should both, and some of the other ones as well, I agree, should be.
I think we'd be with Athilia. It was the Mein Kampf paper was, after all half plagiarized. So I don't think we'd get away with that one.
So which one, you guys wrote about 20 papers, is that right?
Yeah.
And which ones are some of your favorites?
I've enjoyed mostly working with the most sort of densely theoretical ones. So I like When the Joke's on You, the epistemology one. I like the Mein Kampf in the end, because to make that work, what we wanted to show was that almost any awful idea at all could be justified by taking some of the scholarship and twisting it to it. So that required bringing in a lot of different ideas from different places and sort of bringing them all together. So that one is really, really theoretically dense, and I had quite a lot of fun working on that one. And I think as well that one, it got some positive comments, but it was early in the process and it didn't get accepted. I can't be confident that it ever would have, but I am kind of confident. It was the cis-normativity paper. We essentially, and it was based on a very sort of informal survey that I actually did, in which I asked trans people on Reddit if they wanted to censor language in any way, if they felt oppressed by cis-normative language, which is language which assumes that everybody is the gender that they were.
Yeah,
that they were born with.
Uses he and she pronouns for everyone else as well, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. And all of the trans people that I asked, apart from one, overwhelmingly said, no, don't be ridiculous. Language is not a problem. We don't want to censor anybody's language. And this is a problem that I see that's out there quite a lot with the whole sort of trans issues, is that people see the worst of the trans activists and they react to that, and they don't recognise that the vast majority of trans people are just people who are just sort of wanting to live their lives and not be authoritarian and push anybody into anything. So the paper that we wrote on that one, it had an interviewer asking a lot of trans people whether they felt oppressed by language at work, and nearly all of them said no, but she worked out that they were anyway. So that one.
Wow.
And the problem with that, the way it was rejected for at first, that was not so much because we had essentially just overruled our recipients. It was because we'd misgendered, which was so stupid and my fault. We'd misgendered one of the theorists that we'd used, and we'd suggested that trans people could have some responsibility themselves for how they dealt with their environment, and that was very no-go. So those are the ones that I have enjoyed most, but they're also the ones that I think people find least exciting. They tend to enjoy the really sort of mad ones about
rape culture in dog parks.
Rape culture in dog parks,
Yes.
fat bodybuilding, overcoming transphobia and becoming more feminist by anally self-penetrating.
Yes.
They like those ones.
The ones that got published. I mean, I think, what was the one where, I think it was also submitted to Hypatia, where it was something about how we should change pedagogy in order to implement the progressive stack. So we have white males have to be held in chains or something in front of the classroom or something like that.
They're to be invited to be. Yeah. You know,
I really, one of the things a big question I have is that, you know, I read through all of this and I read through all the studies that were published pretty extensively as a social scientist. So I understood also where you guys were being a little silly, but also where you were being very thorough in the literature review. I would really love for if you and your colleagues at some point could release the just documents of the unpublished studies. Would be
they're all out there. There's
okay, because I somehow haven't found them then. Okay, because I would love to read them. To me, that's the most fascinating thing, because I read thousands of these studies every year, legitimate quote unquote ones, and it's really it is indecipherable, pretty much in many ways. And if you don't have the data in front of you, you wouldn't know in any way to be able to delineate often fact from fiction if you're not paying very close attention to this.
Yeah, I mean, it's because I think sometimes people think that it is just any nonsense, and it isn't. There is a very sort of strict code to it. You have to get into the theory. You have to see how it works, what's passable and what isn't. And we'd read a lot. We knew a lot of what was going on, but actually navigating those rules, we made a lot of mistakes, and we were sort of rejected several times for still coming up against certain taboos. We were still not quite problematizing things enough, not quite hitting every mark. So we were getting increasingly good at that. But I think because the papers are so difficult to read and they're often sort of substance free, people aren't reading them. They aren't really seeing what's going on. I mean, New Real Peer Review has done brilliantly with bringing a lot of this to light. But generally, and particularly people like me, you know, left liberal academics who are generally very much in favour of social justice, who care about gender issues, who care about racial issues, sexuality, they're not actually reading the papers, and they have this kind of benign idea that, okay, some things can be a bit silly, but generally it's good scholarship and it's for a good cause. So we really wanted to just sort of try and bring out, no, look, this is what's there and this is what it can be made to do. Do you not think there's a problem here?
I think too, as related to that, as you mentioned that in one of the studies, it was basically that you misgendered somebody. And I remember in the reviewer comments of the first Mein Kampf version was that the author was listed as a white woman, problematizing her own whiteness rather than sort of giving a more, non-white experience to that. Do you think that and I think this is probably the problem here, is that if you had reported to be a trans non-white person on any of these publications, that they might have had a greater proclivity towards publishing them just based off of that, regardless of, again, the potential silliness, although simultaneous rigorousness of the literature review.
We did when we were thinking about the Mein Kampf. We played around with that quite a lot, as you can see if you see the list of things of what we could try to make work. We did think, well, perhaps if we identify ourselves as a racial or sexual minority, this would give us an extra boost. And we decided, for ethical reasons, not to do that. We wanted to try and get the ideas through as they were. We didn't want to claim an identity, but partly because it could then confuse our motivations, but also because we wanted to know that they accepted our work on what it was, despite the fact that some of our writers were men, some of them, and most of them were white women. So it was, but I think quite possibly it could have done if we had claimed a trans woman of colour identity. It might well have made them more reluctant to criticise us.
Yeah, I'm glad that you didn't go with that, because then we got to see those, that response, right? So if you had done that, then still would have probably gotten taken down, but we wouldn't have heard that whole, white feminism argument. And I think it's actually good to see that exposed, right?
The dog park study, though, did claim to be a LGBTQ QIA plus some sort of or non-gender conforming Black activist, I believe. Signed.
Okay. Aydin seems to have gone.
Oh, we lost Aydin. That's okay. She'll be back. She'll be back.
I'll reply to that anyway. But
there she is. There she is.
Sorry,
okay, go on.
I think that was the case. Is that they claimed to be a lesbian Black activist on the dog park study.
She used Black feminist criminology. Yes,
that was it. Yes,
I can't actually remember if she stated her own identity or not with that one. That one was one of the ones I contributed some theory to. Well, I contributed the idea of that we can make a kind of implicit bias test by via perceived perceptions of dogs. So yes, but you might be right. She might have claimed an identity. I don't.
I'd like to
but
add.
It's interesting though.
I want to add something really quick before Aydin gets in there, because you were talking about how the papers are that you guys made. It was very rigorous and they were very dense and kind of complex to read. And I just want to say that. We have a show that we do kind of semi-regularly on our program where we take a feminist, mostly the feminist paper, but usually some kind of a humanities paper that's a real paper, at least it was written with wasn't meant as in the same way that you did. And they take them very seriously. There was like one I remember, it was called The Feminist Water Lily, and we read through them. And these are supposed to be real peer-reviewed academic papers that are circulating. There was one about beavers and how that's a statement on gender as well as environmentalism and how those things are related. You're
probably thinking of the squirrel study that they actually cited.
There was one about beavers.
No, I'm not surprised, but yeah.
And so we read through a bunch of these, right? And the thing is, of all of the ones we've read through, yours were the most clear to us. They had the least amount of kind of gobbledygook postmodern rhetoric in it. It explained terms, it explained concepts, and the citations were really clear. And so even though we knew that what you were doing was you were trying to shine a light on, the stuff that goes on in these peer-reviewed papers, you actually made a very clear case. Like, we could tell what the arguments were, even if we didn't agree with them, or if they were kind of obviously, badly written or bad. Right? They were just bad ideas, but we could see what they were. So actually, your work was actually easier to consume than actual mainstream work. Black Anality was another one. Black Anality. That was so yeah. Those are crazy, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean that was what we wanted to do. I mean, we could certainly, and there's one of them which is the feminist AI paper, artificial intelligence, in which we have gone quite deeply into some very sort of post-structuralist and psychoanalytical ideas, and that one is harder to understand. And the point of it is that it is all about a fragmentation and irrationalism. So that's fine. But generally, what we've tried to do was present the ideas clearly, because we're not trying to sneak anything past anyone. We wanted them to read, understand our ideas, and accept them afterwards, to be able to read our papers, even if they're not in the field. And they're still maybe a bit difficult, and there'd be some need to look up terms if you're not familiar with them. But it is clear, it is accessible. We wanted them to see what the problem was with the ideas, the concepts, the epistemology itself. So we couldn't make it obscurantist for that reason.
Yeah.
Well, I think part of the problem is with academics is what we get into is a cycle of necessity of publication. So what often happens is that we're just pushing something out because I have to publish something this year. I have to. and it can be very ridiculous. It can be kind of baseless. And when you have people who are actually looking into the field, particularly from an outside perspective, oftentimes you get a much more holistic perspective because you're looking at it not from an insular within the field nature. And that is what makes those kinds of studies, I think, quote, exemplary by the definition of the journals themselves, because they're not used to seeing people who are looking at it from a unbiased perspective or a less biased perspective. And that does make them, again, quote, exemplary. And I think that's Hypatia's, well, not Hypatia, what was the,
I think that was
the one that did the dog parts.
Gender, Place and Culture.
Gender, Place and Culture, yeah. Which also, by the way, has some interesting studies. It's not a complete, this is another thing that I don't think that you meant to do, and I'm sure you can clarify here. You didn't mean to discredit any of these journals, but rather to point out a flaw in publication, sort of that is inherent in academia.
Yeah, I mean, I think a certain amount of discrediting of journals is warranted, but we certainly don't want to discredit every scholar that contributes to them. There is still sound empirical work going in all over the place. The problem is when very unsound and unethical work is also acceptable. So when we say grievance studies, we're not really looking at a particular field, we're looking at a certain approach to looking at identity. So that's how we have got things in various places, from masculinity studies to social work to geography, is because we're looking at the approach and the journals which are open to radical cultural constructivism, sort of hierarchies of power, sort of denial of objective truth, and this really sort of deeply inconsistent ideas of justice and equality. So yeah, I mean, we know that there is still good work out there, and that is what needs to be built on, and it will be much easier to do that when there isn't this minefield of taboos around there. At the moment, people who want to write about issues can either write about it in the right way, in this whole sort of epistemological mess where we understand that knowledge is a product of your position in society, or they can sort of avoid the issues and write about something else very empirical, like, I don't know, the provision of contraception in some underprivileged area. You know, that is good scholarship, but it has to avoid going into this epistemology.
They do that, though. I would point out, because when I first started to look into all of the journals, and I don't normally read those journals, Hypatia, Gender, Place and Culture, I don't normally read those kinds of journals. I did find, though, when I went in and looked at them, they do occasionally do that kind of scholarship that was actually kind of impressive to me, and as I was unexpecting. It was actually decent scholarship. So I think that what tends to happen when something like this reaches mainstream attention is that there's just a big backlash against everything that the journal has done, or that anyone involved with the journal has published. And I think that, and I hope you would agree, although I don't know, that that's not correct. This is about pointing out a situational and problem with the entire current gestalt of the academy in publishing or accepting the publication of work that is not based on empirical or objective reality, but rather on feelings and emotions. And when you suggest, as many of these journals do, that there is no empirical reality, then anything kind of can fly by.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that, you know, good scholarship can get in as long as it doesn't try to be empirical on sort of sensitive issues, and terrible scholarship can get in. But the way that we picked journals was that we decided to look at a certain topic and make a certain argument. And so we researched specifically, we want to look at feminist and critical race epistemology, some really terrible stuff coming out of this. So we're researching papers, and what is coming up time and time again is Hypatia. So we aimed our work at Hypatia, and that was received positively within 8 days. We revised a few things and it was in. So I do think that I would criticise the journals because they are open to that. I would not say that everything that's going in there is terrible and that they're not also open to some good work, but that isn't really good enough. And we'd see this in any other field. We wouldn't, for example, say, well, this medical journal has published some genuine medical research, but it's also published things which are completely nonsense and potentially dangerous. We'd say, no, that journal has a problem and it needs to sort it out. That doesn't reflect on the good medical scholars.
Yeah, absolutely.
Things in there. And we put in our discussion bit, we wanted to state very clearly, we are not saying that everybody who is studying gender, race or sexuality is studying it in a grievance studies way. The majority of scholarship is still sound. Peer review is still the best method out there, and it still largely works.
Can I ask a question? What do you think is the reason that things are happening, that this is the way that academic papers have gone, that this has gone this way?
Well, that's, I mean, are you asking sort of on an intellectual basis what has changed?
I guess, yeah, what's changed? Like there's been a lot of talk about, the long march in the institutions and things like that. I was wondering what your thoughts are on, why this has happened. And I mean, it's probably been going on a long time, but, if you've, because I mean, obviously something spurred you guys to make these papers, something that, maybe was on your mind or bugging you for a while or something. So, but what do you think is the cause?
I think in the realm of ideas, I think the cause comes back to an epistemic shift which took place in the late 60s, in which leftist academics, a certain number of them, became disillusioned with Marxism, and they conceptualized the idea of postmodernism, that the grand narratives no longer worked, that objective reality, that evidence, that reason was all a construct of power that took place in the modern period, and that it really had to be deconstructed and it had to go. And so there was a big, huge, prolific burst of this, which sort of went on into about the early 80s and then started to die away. And it was taken over then by a sort of second wave of critical theory, which sort of splintered into intersectionality, critical race theory, queer theory, etc. And what this was coming from, this was coming then again much more from society, from culture, the civil rights movements, second wave liberal feminism, queer, sort of LGBT movements, gay pride, had all sort of done great things in sort of decriminalizing homosexuality, giving women access to mortgages and equal pay for the same work, and these kind of things. It had come to a point of diminishing returns where that we're not going to see big advances now because legal equality has largely been achieved. So what we're looking at now is changing some social perceptions. So postmodernism was very attractive to this approach, because then we're into the subjective, we're into looking at how people think, how they talk, we're into interpretive possibilities. So we've got this next wave now, which is, as Kimberly Crenshaw said, is applying contemporary politics to postmodern theory. We've had a kind of proliferation from there, and I think this has caught on with the sort of the public zeitgeist, because we in the UK, we're sort of dealing with post-colonial guilt. America is trying to come to terms with its past of slavery and Jim Crow. So we're at this kind of moral stage where we want to make things equal, to make things fair, to ensure that oppression doesn't continue. So we've come into this stage now for a lot of very good reasons, where some very bad ideas have got in, and it's generally undermined the ideas that we have had and of consistent liberalism. When we're looking at everything within systems of power and privilege that knowledge is constructed somewhere, depending on where you are within these systems, and that it's perpetuated in language, then we see what we see now, where language is dangerous, it can erase people, it can do violence to them, it needs to be regulated. And with every discussion between a man or a woman, a person of colour or a white person, is characterised by a power imbalance, and that this needs to be read in. So there are different rules for how men can speak about women and how women can speak about men, what we can claim to know. And this is all a very on-the-ground version of what has come from a much more sort of complicated intellectual shift within academia, feeding back and forth into each other. And because it's so counterintuitive, and it just doesn't work with our sort of innate senses of reciprocity and fairness, people are finding it very difficult to understand unless they're sort of within that. So what I have tried to do particularly is sort of bring these ideas out and break them down and explain them. Peter has always worked on epistemology, and James looks at the psychology of ideology and extremism. So we have kind of come together to really break down this problem and just try and show it to people. We've written straightforwardly, all of this, for years, and then we have thought, well, no, let's go in there, let's show what's there, let's make what's there, and just try and get people to get their heads around it, to be honest, and not just the average person. The average person sees the symptoms very clearly, and that it's crazy and that it's unethical, even if they don't see where it's coming from. But to get the liberal academics who are kind of burying their head in the sand quite a bit, they don't believe in all this. They know there are mad papers out there. They're generally consistently liberal, but they're not wanting to look at the problem, and we wanted them to look at the problem. So that was long.
No, it's okay. It's a great answer. It was a great answer.
Yeah.
And the when you said, just real quick to touch on something you said earlier, when you said that the late 60s, the Marxist thing, they were disillusioned with it, and so they moved over to the postmodernism. When you say that they were disillusioned with Marxism, were you saying that like the idea of the class struggle, like the rich versus the poor thing, or was it like something else? Or
it's the great ideas. Helen mentioned this. The big ideas were the big thing that inspired postmodernism, of these these big ideas, be they democracy, be them Marxism, any of these ideas were all being debated during this point of time. It is the Frankfurt School era and post-Frankfurt School era. So, I mean, obviously get more into it, but yeah, it was everything. Everything needs to be deconstructed, because even the ideas that we thought worked were failing, that they were hopeful for were failing.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's, I mean, when they, because a lot of people still think that the postmodern ideas and Marxism are part of the same thing, but there really has been a strong distinction. The postmodernists are still socialist in the sense that capitalism is one of the boogeymen, alongside patriarchy, white supremacy, and imperialism, as these sort of unseen forces which are permeating everything and putting power imbalances into everything. But the first postmodernists, Foucault, Lyotard, Derrida, they reacted very strongly against Marxism, as Aydin was saying, as a sort of big explanation for everything, a coherent, structured, sort of grand narrative. They weren't having that anymore. But we still have, we still see these sort of oppressed oppressor classes, which often makes people think, have they just moved Marxism onto a different identities? But that, although it's a sort of simple and neat explanation, it tends to miss what's really important, which is the epistemology. It's really important to recognize Marxism as modernist. It claims to have an objective truth. It's probably almost certainly wrong with a lot of the claims, but that is the aim. Whereas postmodernism has gone into this stage of no, everything is subjective. It's direct. It's positional, and this. You need to get your head around that before you can understand really what is going on here. Otherwise, it just seems so inconsistent, so hypocritical that you just can't engage with it.
It's relative disposition, so that, or relative power dynamics, right? So that's how we can constantly be, or claim to be correct in anything that we posit, because relatively this is greater than that in the power dynamic, and relatively this is lower than that in the power dynamic. So it just goes on and on and on, and allows for a kind of, perpetual cycle of these power dynamic of philosophy and publications, therefore, that don't need to be based on any empirical evidence, because you can't prove it empirically, because we're admitting that it's all based on power, which is based on social perspective. So, it allows things to get by that we don't need the kind of empirical evidence for. We would need more quantitative analysis. So, and I think that actually what's really interesting is the more quantitative analysis that you and your colleagues did. Is that there was one study, and I forget which one it was. Oh, it was on the watching of porn, I believe, where the reviewers said that they wanted, and I get that it was, I think, an analysis of like 3 male participants who were the researchers in exposing themselves to pornography, and the researcher or the reviewers requested that you remove the quantitative analysis.
Yeah, exactly. That one, the point of that one obviously was that this was a ludicrously small sample, and that we were going to try and make huge claims from was it 3 or 4? I think just 3, yeah, men's experiences of watching porn and then testing themselves with implicit association tests to see whether they felt more or less positively towards women and their abilities to function in the world. So it's completely ludicrous. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the comments of that, which wasn't a bad one, was that quantitative analysis doesn't really work on such a small sample.
Right. I was actually impressed by that.
Yeah, but they were quite happy for us to make huge qualitative claims for that, and a couple of other occasions as well when we have provided data that it's, well, this is too complicated, no one's going to understand this, can you just be more vague, is a lot of what we've had. So that was, yeah, that was what we were expecting, really. I mean, if we're looking at autoethnography, then the sample gets down to 1, and sort of great conclusions are made about power balances and biases and whatever, just from this one subjective experience. And then this sort of enters a canon as a kind of knowledge that another researcher will draw on to support their own work. And before you know it, you've got this towering structure of subjective nonsense all built on each other, seeming to have a pedigree and a progression. And that is what's so worrying, because if you're doing something like this, I mean, this is how knowledge is meant to build, isn't it? We first discover, say that so there's some reason to believe that evolution by natural selection is a real thing. And then the evidence for that grows and grows and grows until, based on what we've already discovered, until we have a much, much fuller picture. So within the whole sort of grievance studies approach, we've got this building, but it's building of theory upon theory upon theory. And I've had these kind of conversations where someone has said to me, well, we know that toxic masculinity causes this. And well, how do we know this? And she's shown me papers, and I have tried to follow this back. And there's a claim, and which draws on a previous paper, which is just making a claim, which draws on a previous one. And we're going back and back, and there wasn't anything empirical about this in the first place. This has just it's been peer reviewed, it's been accepted as true. Now other people can use it to go that little bit further.
But isn't that the kind of really, I think, ultimate takeaway from the grievance studies research, is that now by necessity, they have to cite you. They have to cite your research on some level. Some of it in particular, the conceptual penis study has to be cited. The jokes on you study need to be cited. That's now within the zeitgeist of their own academic tower, right? They have to cite that of anything that they want to discuss further in that field. And that's the exact thing, because, I know that oftentimes people don't cite preliminary research. They go and cite a citation of a citation of a citation of a citation. You have to go back and find that original research. And if it didn't really find anything substantive, Well, if you didn't look into it, you wouldn't know it. But the way that academia works, we just assume that the other person who was citing the other person, citing the other person, had good intent.
Yeah, and that's how we can get so far away from anything. But then, well-intentioned people who should be able to think that what is being produced in academic peer-reviewed papers is something, we can't be. We shouldn't ever be overconfident that what is coming out is the pinnacle of knowledge, but it should be better than anything else that's out there. This should be what the best research, the best knowledge available. So it really is very worrying when it is so built up on insubstantial, unevidenced claims. And I think it's very unlikely that we're ever going to get cited sincerely. And I think the fields are just generally going to try to pretend that our papers don't exist, to be honest. But we'll probably end up getting cited as purely as evidence of privilege preserving epistemic pushback and white fragility and things, but sure. Not really.
What speaking of which, what kind of response have you had since this all came out? Like, has life changed much?
Yeah, we've been sort of considerably overwhelmed. It's only just starting to die down now. We've had an awful lot of, from academics, we had, first of all, that there was largely a silence from the academics within the fields. Then a sort of pushback from them has come along the lines of, well, you were committing a fraud because you didn't say what your real names were and you didn't actually look at 10,000 dogs' genitals, so we can't believe anything that you say and this doesn't mean anything. Or that we didn't get IRB approval, which you need if you've got human subjects, but we were looking at...
Don't need IRB. There you go.
Yeah, but we were looking at a system. We weren't testing individual scholars or reviewers. We were looking at their work, and we were looking at a system. And then there's the argument that the joke's actually on us because the papers we wrote were good and don't prove anything. And you can get your head around this. If somebody wanted to show that science was using evidence-based epistemology, they could cite a lot of that and do their own work and send it in. It would pass. What would that prove? Nothing. It would just prove that the epistemology of the system works as it says it does. What we wanted to do was show how this system works, because they're not denying it. So this response that we've had, which is very much your papers were good and we stand by the epistemology and the ethics that you used, was very useful to us, because people are accusing us of straw-manning the field, straw-manning the approach, and that this isn't really happening. So yeah, that was helpful with that. Thank you. Yes, these are real papers. This is what's out there. You approve of this. We think that's a problem.
Well, it's actually really meta now that I think about it. So this is probably the first time I've seen. So normally these studies are observing, the studies themselves would observe systems, whether they're systems of heteronormativity or toxic masculinity or maleness or colonialism or whiteness or whatever. And you have just analyzed the system that analyzes these systems. So it's actually really meta, because you could conceivably really make an absolutely valid paper about papers being submitted to academia.
Actually, there is excellent research on that.
Of course there is.
It was something I brought up in my video on it, which there's no reason that you would listen to it. But there was excellent research that goes back to the 70s. There's research from the 80s and even the 90s that shows an extreme degree of bias across all fields of research. That people basically, they were accepting papers that were illegitimate. The only reason that they criticized you and your cohort so extremely is because you didn't tell them before they published it that it was part of essentially an experiment. The problem is, though, is that that's been done many times by other researchers. Now, does the public know about that at all? No, they don't. And that's how academia works. Of course, they don't know about all the studies that have already been done that show academic publication bias. What you and your cohort did was to show the public at large, in a way. I mean, let me see the, I have citations for it here. Oh, where did they go? I can bring them up pretty quickly, but there were several studies that I found, at least from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, that had done all of this that are not known by the general public, that submitted fake papers or that submitted republications of papers to journals and found that they would accept them. And, you know, it's an ongoing process we need to be aware of, and that this is very important to the health of academia and journalistic integrity, I think.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's been a lot of other sort of looks at how the system is working and if it's working properly. I think it was Charlotte Stern, is it? She's been very good on this recently. And I think, yeah, if because the problems with knowledge production can be so varied, you know, there can be, as you said, there's the pressure to publish, and this can cause shoddy work. Then there's inadequate sort of peer review, in which peer reviewers are not paid and they're under a lot of pressure to get things out, and they're not checking properly. And there's also a problem that we're looking at when the issue is with the epistemology that is accepted perfectly legitimately in the field. So I'm not sure, and obviously there was Sokal and his attempt to just befuddle with language, which is one of the main criticisms of postmodernism proper itself. So I think everybody, we need to be looking at all of these different problems, and we have been criticised for just looking at one and asked, for example, why haven't we looked at replication crises in psychology or medical data or cold fusion? And apart from the fact that we don't do that, we're not scientists, we don't have that knowledge, we don't have that expertise. We'd obviously very encouraging of anybody from those fields who sees a problem and wants to address it. This is not a zero-sum issue. We can all be looking at the different problems in different ways.
Mm-hmm. I think things like Retraction Watch, they do this incredibly well. This is not, it is not a one field isolated thing. The ones I was citing were Epstein, 1990, confirmational response biases among social work journals. That's one. There's also, let's see, Mahoney, 1977, publication prejudices, an experimental study of confirmatory biases in the peer review system. This has been going on, but the fact of the matter is, the general public doesn't understand this. And I think that for all of the notes that what you did was, quote, unethical, this has been done in scientific research before. It's just that the fact that you didn't notify the journals that what you were doing was an experiment is all that they can claim as unethical. And I just don't think that reaches unethical, because they agree that the papers are valid. So I don't see the unethical nature of it.
Well, obviously we wouldn't have done it if we had thought it was unethical, and there isn't a way to inform people that we're planning to try and get something in sincerely, because that obviously just wouldn't work. It's a bit more like a surprise customer type thing, where we're going through. We want to see how the system works as it works. We cannot pre-notify them. But the complaints that we're unethical have generally just wanted to shift away focus from what we've actually done and what conclusions can be drawn from it. Should we generally conceal our own names and not be completely straightforward with our intentions? No, but sometimes if you want to work within a system, if you want to see how it works from the inside out, that's something that you have to do. We obviously always intended to come come clean with this in the end. We were caught before at a really annoying time, actually, because we'd just started increasing our acceptance rates and getting going with it. So I think when people have said, well, this is bad faith because you didn't mean the papers you wrote, that misses the point. We are in good faith in looking at the problem that we're looking at. That does require recreating the problem we're looking at and testing it.
Hence my statement about meta-analysis. So you didn't actually face anything really. Like, people weren't trying to ruin your careers or your personal life or anything like that, right? No blowback to this degree. I
am fairly fortunate because I'm the editor of a magazine. I work for myself. There's really only my reputation that can be destroyed. James too. He has his own business which is unconnected. We're fairly safe. When it comes to Peter, I watch this space.
Peter is, by the way, a professor of philosophy, correct?
Yeah, at Portland State University.
That's the real fear that we've had for this entire thing. And, I've been essentially expelled from academia. So, this is you have done far more than I have, and I've been expelled from academia. So, well...
Yeah, that was my concern too. Whereas, if there were any unforeseeable consequences that might be disproportionate considering what you guys have done.
Well, as I said, I think you're going to have to watch this space. There are things going on, and we will tell people what's happening when we know anything.
Okay. And, we're actually, unfortunately, because I'm really enjoying this conversation, again, I want to thank you for coming on. Also, a quick message to the people that are watching. If you're watching this on Honey Badger Radio, you need to go over to Badger Live Streams and subscribe there so you can see the show live and also participate in the chat. And if you have any questions for Helen, put a super chat in and I will read it out so you guys can ask her whatever. Okay, so we only got about 7 minutes left and then I have to end the show because I have to do an after show and then prepare for another show. So I have to do a hard stop at an hour. But I want to ask you, now that you've done this and you've seen all of this that happened, what do you think... do you think there needs to be a change? Which I think I know the answer to that question, but I probably should ask it anyway. And how would you like to see this academia, I guess, or at least these specific sciences, how would you like to see them change going forward?
It is still very early days, and what we've seen at the moment is really a lot of anger and a lot of unreasonable objections, but I'm somewhat encouraged by by the enormous number of liberal left academics who've written to us privately, and we're thinking of setting up some kind of forum so they can know how many of them there are and sort of be emboldened by it. There have also been a very small number of people who previously thought we were exaggerating the problem, like leftist academics, who now think that we're not. But most encouragingly, there's been a tendency for sort of empirical scholars within the field to distance themselves from it and say things like, we always knew, even when they're annoyed with us and blaming us, they're still saying, we always knew that there was this problem, and that this is nothing to do with a lot of our work. And so I think we're seeing a distancing. This has become somewhat embarrassing. More people are willing to say that's not the kind of work I do. So that I find encouraging. We've also had a few productive conversations with some right-wing academics who have been inclined to throw the whole enterprise under the bus, who have actually been surprisingly sort of positive and in the sense of saying, okay, you're leftism, you've shown a problem on your side, perhaps it's time for us to look at the looms on our own side. So this is what we've been calling the productive politics approach, where some actual reasoned conversation has been going on over the divide. So we are seeing something positive. Whether it will amount to anything, I don't know. It's still very early. It could just fizzle. They could just ignore us and carry on. But we'll have to see.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that part of it could be, since we were on the topic of, you mentioned right-wing academics, do you think that there is a problem with, let's say, a level of, this is just something I've heard, so I don't know, again, if I'm wrong, then please correct me, with a sort of like a hegemonic way of thinking within academic circles, like for example, a lack of, as people would say, a diversity of thought. Like maybe there aren't as many. If you're more of a right-wing student, you're sort of like, made to feel as though you shouldn't speak up, that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Do you think that could be part of the problem?
Yes, completely. And I in our essay that James and I wrote, as our principal defence of the university, we used some statistics both from the US and the UK to show how left-leaning sort of the whole sort of academy is at the moment. I mean, maybe agriculture, I think, is the area in which there's a significant number of right-wing academics, but it's just got increasingly left-leaning. And we do need to have, and what happens when a field is just dominated by one political view is that it tends to navel gaze, feed on itself, stagnate, and also get a bit mad. So even though I don't agree with a lot of almost any right-wing view, I do appreciate that need the pushback from that to make scholarship productive.
Right. We need to have the discussions, right? Let the best ideas win and that kind of thing.
There's also a discrimination issue. Obviously, it shouldn't be acceptable to discriminate against conservative academics. There's a tendency now to see conservative as racist, sexist, and homophobic, and to justify discriminating against them on the grounds that they wouldn't be fair to work with, and that isn't justified. Mm-hmm. So we looked at, and we cited again in that essay, some left-wing and right-wing academics in one study that we cited were equally willing to discriminate against each other, but because of the larger, much larger proportion on the left, this is going to sort of affect conservative academics much more, and we need to make this not acceptable.
Okay. Right. I think based on everything that we know about social identity theory, self-categorization, uncertainty reduction theory, all of this, or uncertainty identity theory, everything we know about this indicates that people will always discriminate against the out group a little bit. So unfortunately, though, when you have the vast majority of people being left-wing in academia, they end up controlling what happens. And that is, why I'm not in academia anymore. And it is it's a fear, I think, not just for ignoring people like myself, but more importantly, young people who are entering academia in order to learn might feel as if they can't be themselves, that they can't express themselves, and certainly that they can't maintain any opinions that they come into the academy holding that might be more conservative. And that is, I'm not saying they shouldn't be open to new ideas, but the fear is that there cannot be a diversity of ideas within the academy anymore. And that's the real fear. And for someone who loves academia, it's upsetting. And I think that's why I really liked, everything that you and your colleagues have done, because it exposes this. And I think that you and your colleagues all also appreciate the concept of the academy and academia as a structure, as an idea. And are, as am I, disconcerted with its current state.
Yeah, we need to say that. I mean, that was the point of that essay. There is an anti-intellectual pushback from the far right against it, and that is something that we need to counteract. We need to strengthen it, the university, if we don't want the accusations against it to certain fields to have credibility. And it isn't only the right who are sort of persona non grata, that you getting deplatformed if you are a radical feminist who is gender critical, and that
like a TERF.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
That's certainly not conservative. They're almost always deeply socialist, often Marxist, and and liberals on the left, if they're
and moderates.
Yeah, moderates. If you believe in any way in a meritocracy or an equality of
opportunity,
or sort of universality, even if you are left wing on that, then this is still regarded as grounds for protest.
Well, I really enjoyed this talk, Helen. I hope that you did. See, we're not bad, even though we're MRAs. I'm not including Aydin in that. I don't want to speak for her, but we here at HBR. Okay, so there you go.
So I wouldn't talk to you guys if I didn't, probably.
Yeah, I guess not. I mean, there's a lot of people who don't want to use a label, but they'll talk to us. But anyway, but thanks for coming. What was that?
I'm always happy to talk to either feminists or MRAs, although I disagree with both of them. But I very much enjoyed the conversation.
Yes, I'm really glad that you came on, and I think I can speak safely for most of us that watched to say that what you did was incredible, what you guys did, and I hope that it starts a conversation within academia to maybe move towards addressing it. I think it is an issue. Again, not to discount all of the humanities, and I have Aydin to thank because I had a really negative view towards the social sciences before I met her, and now I just think it definitely has value, but it needs an overhaul. Let's put it that way. And so
and I'd like to thank Aydin for having read our papers and seen so clearly what it was we were doing.
Oh, absolutely. I thought it really just made my whole month at least. It was amazing. I love what you and your colleagues have done, and I think there needs to be more of it. We need to expose academia when we find error in what we're doing, and there's no better way to do it than by doing it with very thorough literature review and review of the actual things that are going on within the subject matter field.
Yes. So with that said, though, we got to close out the show and go into our after show. I want to thank you again, Helen Pluckrose, for coming on. I put your Twitter in the low bar. I don't know if that's the best way for people to reach you.
Yes, Twitter. Not for the next week, but Twitter is where I'm usually to be found most.
Okay, so if you guys want to shoot her a message of support or any comments about today's show, just do that through the Twitters. She won't be around for a week, but after that, go ahead and give her a follow. And I want to thank Aydin again for coming on, especially considering I kind of screwed up the time. So thank you, Aydin. And so that being said, we're going to go into the after show. I want to thank you guys again for coming on the Doge and Aydin Show. And we'll talk to you guys very soon. I'll be back in about an hour. Messages for men.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.